Beneath the weight of decades, there are vaults that do not echo and rooms where the air itself seems to remember. Hidden in the folds of time are fragments of wars that never truly ended, operations buried under ink, experiments that vanished into rumor, names erased with precision. Somewhere between victory and silence, entire histories were sealed away, their truths locked behind welded doors and falsified reports. The world moved on, but in the shadows of forgotten archives, the machinery of secrecy kept turning. It hums like static across the old frequency bands, a pulse that never stopped transmitting. What remains are fragments, stamped, redacted, smudged by the hands of those who tried to erase them. And in those fragments lies a different story, one that doesn't belong to the victors or the vanquished, but to the ghosts of the unseen war that followed, whispering from the darkened corners of the past. Chapter 1: Operation Paperclip, The Hidden Exodus. In the final days of April 1945, as Berlin burned and the Third Reich disintegrated, convoys of American intelligence officers moved quietly through the rubble-strewn outskirts of southern Germany. Their mission was not to capture generals or secure gold, but to locate minds, the engineers, physicians, and scientists whose knowledge could define the next war. Under an innocuous title, Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the United States launched what would later be known as Operation Paperclip. Officially, it was a recruitment drive to prevent Nazi technology from falling into Soviet hands. Unofficially, it became a moral labyrinth, twisting the ideals of victory into something uncomfortably pragmatic. The first group of targets was listed in a classified document known as the Ozenberg List, recovered from a toilet cistern in Bonn. Inside were thousands of names of scientists once deemed essential to the Reich. Among them, Werner von Braun, the young engineer who had overseen V2 production in Peenemünde, Hubertus Strughold, a physician linked to hypothermia experiments in Dachau, and Kurt de Boos, a launch director under the SS. Their files, marked with red swastika seals, were quietly copied, sanitized, and reissued under American clerical letterhead. The term paperclip came from the literal metal clips used to attach false employment records over incriminating backgrounds. In June 1945, US Army intelligence teams operating under Operation Overcast began transferring these men from internment camps to temporary research facilities in the American zone. The Soviets, advancing from the east, had similar ambitions, raiding factories and universities in Thuringia and Saxony for scientists to deport to Moscow. Entire laboratories were stripped overnight. The Americans, desperate to maintain technological superiority, accelerated their extractions. Declassified memoranda from General Lucius D. Clay's office revealed direct orders to procure all personnel of technical value, irrespective of prior affiliation. By autumn, over 1,600 German specialists and their families had been relocated under new identities. At Fort Bliss, Texas, and later at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, these men resumed their work on advanced rocketry. The desert sands that had once tested V2 prototypes now hosted American missiles carrying their genetic blueprint. But the sanitized files could not erase what had happened in Mittelwerk, the underground factory where thousands of concentration camp prisoners had perished assembling those same rockets. When congressional investigators began asking questions, the Department of Defense provided carefully edited personnel dossiers, omitting SS ranks and affiliations. An internal memo from 1947, marked Eyes Only, JIOA, stated bluntly, "Public exposure of individual wartime conduct will impede research continuity. Maintain classification." Operation Paperclip soon extended beyond rocketry. At Wright Field in Ohio, Luftwaffe aeromedical experts conducted studies on human endurance based on data extracted from camp experiments. At Fort Detrick, biochemists once tied to the Reich's nerve gas division began contributing to early germ warfare research. One Army intelligence officer later recalled, "It was as if the Reich had changed flags, not ideologies." By 1950, at least a dozen former SS officers were on US government payrolls, their files cleansed, their pasts reduced to bureaucratic blanks. In 1952, an internal Justice Department inquiry known as the Donnelly Report raised ethical concerns about the program. Investigators discovered that certain paperclip recruits had falsified affidavits regarding war crimes participation. One file, concerning Dr. Walter Schreiber, revealed his connection to typhus vaccine experiments on inmates in Buchenwald. When the press obtained fragments of this information, the Pentagon arranged Schreiber's quiet relocation to Argentina. The story was buried within days, labeled Cold War security matter. The competition with the Soviets justified everything. When Stalin launched his own recruitment, Operation Osoaviakim, he deported over 2,000 German engineers and their families to work in secret research towns east of Moscow. The United States interpreted this as confirmation that its own moral compromises were necessary. The ideological war had shifted from battlefields to laboratories, and the scientists were its new soldiers. A confidential CIA report from 1953 warned, failure to secure technical dominance will render atomic deterrence ineffective. Existing ethical objections are secondary to national survival. Meanwhile, the German scientists themselves navigated their new lives in carefully controlled anonymity. Many lived on restricted military bases, their mail censored and their movements monitored. Some expressed quiet relief at having escaped Soviet captivity. Others adapted with pragmatic detachment. In later interviews, Werner von Braun would insist he had been a technician, not a politician. But internal army correspondences contradict that claim, noting his SS rank and awareness of forced labor conditions. Still, his expertise proved indispensable to the development of the Redstone and Jupiter rockets, precursors to America's intercontinental missile systems. By 1957, as the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, von Braun's team at Huntsville, Alabama, became the cornerstone of NASA's future. The irony was palpable. The man who had once built Hitler's vengeance weapon now stood as the father of American space exploration. The program that had begun as a covert military salvage mission had become the foundation of US scientific prestige. Only decades later, through the 1985 declassification of WWII files, would the full extent of the moral compromise emerge. Among those files was a memorandum dated 23rd March 1946, authored by Colonel Donald Putt, titled Evaluation of German Scientific Assets. The final paragraph reads, "These men represent a paradox, architects of atrocity and pioneers of progress. Their knowledge may serve peace, but its origins must remain obscured. History will judge results, not methods." That line, underlined in pencil by a later archivist, encapsulated the essence of Paperclip's shadow. In 1999, the US government quietly admitted that several scientists imported under Operation Paperclip had indeed been involved in human experimentation and war crimes. Yet by then the legacy was irreversible. The rockets launched, the technologies advanced, the Cold War survived, and so did the myth of ethical victory. The classified files, now brittle and fading, reveal no villains or heroes, only transactions conducted in the language of survival. In the final audit of the JIOA archives, one folder stands out, code reference PCL47B, subject Braun, Werner. Within it lies a photograph, dated 1944, of von Braun standing beside the skeletal remains of a V-2 test fuselage inside the Mittelwerk tunnels. On the reverse, a handwritten note in English reads, "Recovered asset, future value, exceptional." The paperclip rusted long ago, but the imprint remains, binding together the two faces of victory, the one history celebrates and the one it prefers to forget. Chapter 2. The Ghost Convoy of the Baltic. In the winter of 1945, the Baltic Sea was a graveyard. Soviet artillery thundered across East Prussia, cutting through frozen refugee lines as the Third Reich collapsed. Amid that chaos, a small fleet of German merchant vessels left the port of Gottenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, under heavy fog. The convoy's official designation was Transportgruppe Ostsee 17, ostensibly tasked with evacuating civilians and wounded soldiers, but Allied naval decrypts, unearthed decades later from British Admiralty archives, reveal coded cargo manifests marked with strange designations: Ahnenerbe 04, Kronos, and Project K. The accompanying radio logs noted a strict transmission silence order, signed by a Colonel Erich Haller of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service. Then, sometime between January 30 and February 2, the entire convoy vanished. Official German records list 12 ships departing that night. Only one, SS Weserland, was ever confirmed sunk, torpedoed by a Soviet submarine near Bornholm. The rest disappeared without trace. Survivors rescued from lifeboats spoke of panic and confusion, of being ordered below deck as cargo was jettisoned into the sea. One sailor, interrogated by the British in Lübeck weeks later, recalled crates sealed in black wax, bearing the Reichsadler and the initials AA. When pressed on their contents, he went silent, claiming that the cargo was not of this world. His testimony was dismissed as delirium. The transcript, however, was classified and stored in a file labeled Naval Intelligence, Restricted Access Materials. In 1948, during the Nuremberg follow-up trials, a former SS logistics officer named Reinhard Vogt testified under oath about special shipments transported under direct orders from Himmler's Ahnenerbe Institute. These consignments, he said, contained cultural artifacts, experimental documents, and objects of technological significance. Cross-referencing his statement with Kriegsmarine shipping logs led researchers to a pattern. Several vessels that left northern ports in early 1945 under the guise of refugee evacuations had identical cargo annotations, cryptic references to Project Kronos. When Allied intelligence requested clarification, surviving German officials insisted the term referred to time-fused demolition devices used for scuttling ships. Yet the accompanying documentation bore the seal of the SS Research Department, not the Navy. In 1956, British intelligence declassified portions of the Baltic intercepts, naval signal captures made by HMS Onyx and HMS Perseus during the last months of the war. Among the transmissions was a short Morse message intercepted on February 1, 1945. Cargo secured, departing zone red, silence beyond Bornholm, Kronos to be submerged if intercepted. The message's signature matched that of Kapitan Zursee Otto Schreiber, commander of the cargo vessel Thule. His name appeared nowhere in post-war surrender records. Neither did his ship. The Soviets conducted their own investigations. According to files declassified in the 1990s from the Russian Central Naval Archives, Stalin personally ordered a recovery operation in May 1946 under the authority of SMERSH, the Counterintelligence Directorate. The mission, Operation Severny Schleuse, Northern Gate, deployed divers from Kronstadt to search for wrecks near the Bornholm Trench, one of the deepest points in the Baltic Sea. Reports from those dives mention metal containers of non-standard dimension and unknown alloys resistant to cutting tools. The recovered items were shipped by rail to Leningrad, and the operation file was sealed under the codename Objekt 12. Western intelligence agencies learned of this recovery only years later through defectors. A 1962 CIA field summary noted rumors of anomalous materials stored at a Soviet naval facility in Baltic, purportedly recovered from a sunken German convoy. The agency's internal analysts dismissed the claims as Cold War disinformation. Yet, when British divers from the Royal Navy's Historical Salvage Unit attempted to locate wrecks in the same area in 1972, they encountered a no-entry order issued by the Soviet Baltic Fleet, extending a 50-kilometer exclusion zone around the coordinates. Whatever lay beneath the surface was still guarded, decades after the war. Back in Germany, local fishermen in the 1950s often reported snaring heavy metallic fragments in their nets near the Stolper Bank. One trawler captain, Hans Dittmann, described finding a lead-sealed crate stamped RLM, Peenemünde 1944. Inside were sheets of corroded blueprints depicting aircraft without visible propellers, annotated in Gothic script with the words Sondergerät 42. The crate was confiscated within days by British occupation authorities, and Dittmann was questioned by MI6 officers at Kiel. His testimony remains classified, but a fragment of the confiscation report survives, noting the crate's reassignment to Special Evaluation Section London. By the 1980s, researchers attempting to trace the lost convoy's documentation encountered a strange pattern of redactions. Kriegsmarine archive entries for the relevant ships had been altered, dates modified, command rosters replaced with blank entries, tonnage estimates reduced to zero. The gaps suggested deliberate tampering. Independent historian Karl-Heinz Röder, in his unpublished 1987 manuscript Der verlorene Geleitzug, concluded that the convoy had carried remnants of a high-level evacuation, possibly linked to Ahnenerbe expeditions in Tibet and the Caucasus. He cited letters between SS scientist Dr. Wilhelm Wolff and Himmler's adjutant referring to urgent transfer of secured cultural assets to the Baltic region in January 1945. Röder's manuscript disappeared after his death. Only photocopies of 3 pages survive in private collections. In 2004, a multinational dive team led by Swedish marine archaeologist Erik Lundström conducted sonar mapping of the Bornholm Deep. They discovered several anomalies resembling hull shapes, but each was heavily corroded and partially buried under sediment. One object, roughly 35 meters in length, emitted unusual magnetic interference that disabled nearby equipment. The expedition was terminated after Swedish authorities received diplomatic pressure from Moscow, citing unresolved territorial sensitivities. Lundström's final log entry simply read, "Something still hums down there." Among the last surviving wartime witnesses was a Kriegsmarine radio operator named Otto Meissner, interviewed in 1989 in Lübeck. He recalled being stationed at Gottenhafen when the convoy departed. "We were told those ships carried relics, maybe gold," he said. But the officers spoke of Kronos as if it were alive, something that couldn't fall into enemy hands. When asked what he thought happened to the ships, Meissner shook his head. They were meant to disappear. That was the order. The mystery endures in naval archives, preserved as a case without closure. The British file labelled ADM 238-991, Baltic Ghost Convoy, remains partially redacted even today, citing continued relevance to defence research. What began as a wartime evacuation may have been something else entirely, a final attempt by a dying regime to bury its most dangerous discoveries beneath the sea. The waters off Bornholm are calm now, the wrecks invisible beneath layers of silt and secrecy, yet sonar echoes still return faint metallic tones, deep and deliberate, like a coded message trapped beneath the cold surface of history. And if the legends whispered among Baltic sailors hold any truth, the sea did not consume the convoy. It keeps it, silent and sealed, waiting for someone to ask again what exactly the Reich was trying to hide when the world was collapsing around it. Chapter 3. Project Harbinger. The Arctic Listening Posts. In 1951, amid the rising paranoia of the Cold War, the United States Air Force initiated an operation under the innocuous title Arctic Weather Observation Network. In reality, it was a classified intelligence initiative codenamed Project Harbinger, designed to monitor Soviet long-range communications, missile tests, and bomber movements across the polar frontier. Officially under the jurisdiction of the Air Defense Command, its true control rested with the Armed Forces Security Agency, a forerunner of the NSA. Between 1952 and 1955, a chain of covert listening posts was constructed across the northern wilderness. From Thule in Greenland, through Baffin Island, to remote sectors of Alaska and northern Norway. They were known internally by their call signs: Echo Station, Nord 2, Delta Ice, and Harbinger Prime. Each installation operated under extreme isolation, equipped with prototype, long-range radar arrays and cryogenic signal, amplifiers capable of intercepting ultra-low frequency transmissions from thousands of kilometers away. Personnel records list only 42 men assigned to the project, most of them communications engineers with prior service in the Army Signal Corps or OSS cryptography divisions. Many were veterans of Europe who had transitioned into the shadow world of electronic warfare. One of them, Lieutenant Robert H. Kearns, left behind a personal journal that was later declassified in fragments under the Freedom of Information Act. His first entry from Thule, dated February 9, 1953, reads, "Temperature -40. No sunlight for 2 months. Received first coded transmission from Point Harbinger. Message unreadable. Sequence repeats every 47 seconds. Command says interference. Feels deliberate." By early 1954, reports from 3 separate stations recorded identical patterns. Bursts of static punctuated by rhythmic signals resembling Morse, but with intervals inconsistent with human transmission. Analysts initially assumed atmospheric anomalies caused by auroral activity. However, a classified internal memorandum from Harbinger Prime to the Pentagon, dated March 17, 1954, proposed another explanation. Source appears artificial. Coordinates correspond to Sector 83N, 40E, area of former German weather installation Harbinger, abandoned in 1945. Recommend aerial survey. The recommendation was ignored. Officially, the coordinates lay within Soviet-controlled territory. In October 1954, a reconnaissance flight from Thule reported visual confirmation of a metallic structure protruding from the ice near Nordøstlandet, Svalbard. Photographs taken by Air Force Captain Alan Weaver depict angular constructions inconsistent with any known Allied or Soviet design. The images were classified top secret, eyes only, AFSA. Within weeks, a joint British-American expedition was quietly organized under the pretense of geological survey work. The team reached the site in February 1955. Their base radioed intermittent updates for 5 days, then silence. The last transmission, logged at 03:42 GMT on February 12th, contained a single phrase: "We are not alone out here." Recovery efforts were delayed by severe weather. When a second team arrived in March, they found the camp deserted. Tents collapsed, instruments frozen mid-operation, no sign of struggle. Inside a partially buried structure resembling a bunker entrance, they discovered crates marked Reichsministerium für Rüstung und Kriegsproduktion and Peenemünde Versuchsanstalt, 1944. Within one, a sealed cylinder contained a spool of magnetic tape. It was labeled Project Eisstimme version B. The tape was later analyzed at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, where technicians discovered it emitted faint electromagnetic pulses despite no power source. The recording itself was indecipherable, only a loop of static interlaced with deep mechanical hums. In 1956, Project Harbinger was abruptly terminated. All personnel were reassigned and the installations dismantled. Official justification cited budgetary realignment and environmental impracticality. However, internal correspondence from the Office of Scientific Intelligence reveals a different motive. A memo dated August 3, 1956 stated, "Subject Harbinger has encountered anomalous interference of probable foreign origin. Recommends cessation of Arctic monitoring pending containment." The classified attachments referenced unconfirmed retrievals of enemy origin. Technology, a phrase used, nowhere else in the available record. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, began expanding its own Northern Observation Network under the Ministry of Defense's 7E Sector Initiative. Declassified GRU files from the 1990s describe a 1958 discovery by Soviet geologists on the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, a site containing metallic debris inconsistent with local geology. The material was transferred to a facility near Murmansk for analysis and later linked, through American intelligence intercepts, to the former German station Harbinger. Both superpowers appeared to be searching for the same thing, though neither admitted to finding it. Kern's surviving journal entries suggest growing paranoia during his final months at Harbinger Prime. He describes voices in the signal patterns, references to screaming metal beneath the ice, and repeated interference disrupting long-range radar sweeps. His final entry, dated June 1, 1955, reads, "Command insists transmissions are atmospheric, but they answer when we change frequency. They mimic our code. If this is Soviet, it's beyond anything we've seen." After that, the entries stop. His personnel file lists him as medically discharged in September 1955 for psychological fatigue. No further trace of him exists. When the National Security Archive released partial Project Harbinger documentation in 2009, most technical details were redacted. What remained painted an unsettling picture. Engineers had logged measurable signal feedback from an unknown source of non-terrestrial frequency characteristics. The data correlated with coordinates corresponding exactly to the abandoned German station Harbinger. An accompanying note, hand-signed by Brigadier General R.T. McCoy, reads, "These are not Soviet transmissions. Source may predate both conflicts." The note was later crossed out and stamped redacted disinformation. The Arctic bases themselves left physical traces. Aerial photographs from 1957 showed dismantled antenna fields, hangars, and storage bunkers partially buried under snow. In one image from Nord 2, a faint circular indentation can be seen on the ice surface, 20 meters wide, perfectly symmetrical. The official caption identifies it as storage tank collapse, though the pattern resembles no known structural footprint. Civilian researchers who visited the site in 1982 reported unusually high magnetic readings and the presence of discolored ice extending several meters deep, as if subjected to heat. By the early 1960s, most former Harbinger personnel had disappeared into civilian research institutions or defense contractors. When questioned by journalists years later, they consistently denied knowledge of the program. Only one, an engineer named Martin Connors, spoke briefly before his death in 1979. In a recorded interview, he said, "We thought we were listening to the Soviets, But what we heard was older. Older than the war, older than radio itself. The tape ends abruptly, his voice cut by static. Today, fragments of Project Harbinger remain sealed in Department of Defense vaults under classification level Gamma Black. Freedom of Information requests consistently return the same response. Records do not exist, but in private collections, faded microfilm copies of intercepted transmissions still circulate among historians. Each bears the same cryptic sequence, a repeating pulse, measured precisely at 47-second intervals. Whether artifact, accident, or echo of something buried beneath the Arctic ice, no one has explained it. What began as a Cold War intelligence effort ended as a whisper in the static. The sound of history listening back through the frozen air of a place where the world's secrets go to die. Chapter 4. The Vatican Dossiers, Operation Silence. In 1946, while the ashes of Europe still smouldered, the heart of Rome became a crossroads for fugitives, agents, and ghosts of the defeated Reich. Within the marble corridors of the Vatican, a covert network operated under a benevolent disguise, the relocation of displaced persons and war refugees. In truth, it was a clandestine pipeline known to Allied intelligence as Operation Silence. Its function was to exfiltrate select Axis personnel, SS officers, intelligence specialists, and scientists through the so-called rat lines, secret escape routes stretching from Italy to Spain, Syria, and Argentina. The operation existed at the intersection of faith and espionage, driven by the politics of the emerging Cold War. Its files, sealed in Vatican archives under the classification Archivio S, Section 13, tell a story of moral compromise written in ink, gold, and blood. The origins of Operation Silence trace to the Office of Strategic Services Rome mission, led by Colonel James Angleton in late 1945. Angleton's task was to establish intelligence dominance in post-war Europe, particularly against Soviet infiltration. He quickly realized that the Catholic Church controlled the only stable logistics network left on the continent: monasteries, charities, and clerical travel permits that moved freely across occupied zones. OSS reports describe this infrastructure as an ecclesiastical postal system capable of concealing men instead of letters. Angleton's liaison within the Vatican was Bishop Alois Hudal, rector of the Pontificio Istituto Teutonico Santa Maria dell'Anima. Hudal was already sheltering German officers under assumed identities, providing them with Red Cross travel, papers stamped with papal authorization. One of the earliest documented exfiltrations under Operation Silence occurred in January 1946. SS Captain Klaus Reinhardt, formerly attached to the Reich Main Security Office, RSHA, entered the Vatican disguised as a Franciscan monk. Within weeks, he was issued identity papers under the name Franz Müller and sent via Genoa aboard the freighter San Giorgio, bound for Buenos Aires. A Vatican courier carried his sealed file to the Argentine legation, where sympathetic diplomats arranged his visa. Declassified OSS intercepts confirm that similar operations were conducted for at least 50 individuals during that year. Many were wanted for war crimes in Yugoslavia and Poland. None were ever extradited. Officially, the Holy See denied involvement. Yet documents recovered from the British Embassy in Rome show otherwise. A cable dated February 17, 1947, from Ambassador Sir Darcy Osborne to London reads: "Strong evidence that clerical channels are being used to shelter and transfer wanted German nationals. US intelligence appears complicit. Motives appear anti-Soviet in nature." Attached to the cable was a summary of intercepted correspondence between Hudal and Cardinal Montini, later Pope Paul VI, discussing the moral imperative to preserve European knowledge from Bolshevik retribution. The phrase European knowledge was a euphemism used by Allied intelligence to refer to captured Axis research and personnel assets. By 1948, Operation Silence had evolved into a coordinated tri-party arrangement. The Vatican provided sanctuary and documentation. The OSS, soon to become the CIA, provided funding and transport, and sympathetic South American regimes offered safe haven. Argentine archival records released in 1998 detail hundreds of arrivals under ecclesiastical protection. Among them were doctors from Dachau's medical division, Luftwaffe engineers, and even former Gestapo analysts who later advised Perón's secret police. Each bore travel papers featuring identical clerical seals, Comissio de Auxilio Fraterna. a hidden financial mechanism underpinned the operation. Gold looted from occupied territories, estimated at over 20 tons, had been deposited in Vatican-affiliated banks under the guise of reconstruction aid. The US Treasury's 1947 report on foreign assets of Axis origin contains a redacted section titled Ecclesiastical Accounts, Restricted. The unredacted portion lists transfers through Banco Ambrosiano and the Institute for Religious Works, better known as the Vatican Bank. Though the report's conclusions remain classified, a handwritten note in the margin by Treasury investigator Harold Glasser reads, "Funds linked to intelligence asset pipeline. Do not pursue." The moral justification for the network lay in its framing as an anti-communist necessity. As Soviet forces consolidated control over Eastern Europe, American intelligence prioritized containment over justice. Operation Silence became the model for a new kind of alliance, one where ethics bowed to expedience. The Vatican provided deniability, the Americans gained access to German expertise, and the Church preserved its spiritual authority by never acknowledging the operation's existence. Yet evidence suggests the cooperation went deeper than political pragmatism. A 1949 memorandum from OSS officer Robert Bishop, declassified in 2011, describes a confidential exchange between Vatican authorities and US intelligence regarding files recovered from German archives. These Vatican dossiers, as they were later called, allegedly contained information about Nazi experiments, Soviet infiltration within the clergy, and secret diplomatic correspondences between the Reich and the Holy See dating back to 1939. The Americans viewed the files as leverage. The Vatican saw them as protection. No copies of these dossiers have ever surfaced publicly, though references persist in CIA record inventories under the tag SEL-FI 1949. In 1950, the newly formed CIA assumed direct control over the operation. The OSS veterans were replaced with officers from the Office of Policy Coordination, specializing in covert action. Under their oversight, Operation Silence transitioned from evacuation to intelligence gathering. Former Nazis resettled through the network were now providing reports on Soviet influence in Latin America and the Middle East. Files released under the Nazi war crimes. Disclosure Act mentioned at least a dozen such informants, each categorized as exfiltrated asset, religious cover. Not everyone within the Vatican approved. Archbishop Giovanni Battista Montini, who would later ascend to the papacy, privately expressed alarm over the pollution of mercy with espionage. His personal diary, published posthumously in fragments, includes a chilling entry from April 1951. "We trade absolution for intelligence, and both lose their sanctity." But by then, the machinery of Operation Silence was too deeply embedded to stop. In 1953, an internal scandal threatened to expose the network. An Italian journalist, Vittorio De Angelis, obtained forged travel documents linking the Vatican to a wanted SS officer in Rome. Before he could publish, he was found dead in the Tiber River. His notes disappeared. 2 weeks later, Angleton, now CIA station chief, met privately with Cardinal Montini. According to an unverified memorandum in the church archives, the discussion ended with Montini's quiet request: "Let it be buried with the century." By the time Operation Silence was finally dismantled in 1957, hundreds of Axis fugitives had vanished into the anonymity of new lives across the globe. Some became Cold War advisors, others faded into obscurity. The Vatican dossiers were sealed in a special archive accessible only by papal decree. The United States classified its own files until 2045. When fragments of these documents surfaced in 2001 through an Italian investigative report, they revealed the final layer of the operation: correspondence between the OSS, the Vatican Secretariat of State, and the Argentine government. One letter, dated November 5, 1946, contained a simple phrase written in Latin across the top margin: "Veritas moritur in silentio," truth dies in silence. Beneath it, in English, a typewritten annotation read, "Approved for execution under joint authority. File closed." The phrase, once dismissed as metaphor, now reads like an epitaph for an era. Operation Silence did not end with a scandal or revelation. It dissolved, unacknowledged, absorbed into the moral fog of the Cold War. Its architects became statesmen and saints, its victims, names in forgotten ledgers. But deep in the Vatican vaults, beneath frescoed ceilings and marble saints, A box remains sealed with wax and brass, marked only Silence 1946-1957. And inside it, perhaps, lies the one truth no confession ever brought to light. Chapter 5, The Siberian Vault, Stalin's Hidden Reich Files. In the spring of 1992, as the Soviet Union dissolved into fragments of its former empire, a team of archivists working within the Russian Ministry of Defense stumbled upon a sealed sub-level beneath the General Staff Building on Znamenka Street, Moscow. The chamber, accessible only through a welded steel hatch, had not appeared on any architectural blueprints. Inside lay dozens of rusted crates, each stamped with the Reichsadler and overmarked in Cyrillic with the word Archiv, archive. The walls were lined with moisture-blackened shelving filled with boxes of German military files, microfilm reels, and rolls of photographic negatives. Some crates carried dual seals, one of the Wehrmacht, another of the NKVD. This forgotten room, catalogued hastily as Vault 731B, would come to be known among Western intelligence circles as the Siberian Vault. According to declassified Russian internal memos dated from 1946 to 1953, the contents of the vault were the result of Operation Archive, a top-secret Soviet program personally authorized by Joseph Stalin. The mission's objective was simple: to seize and consolidate all captured German scientific, intelligence, and technical materials from occupied territories into a centralized repository for exploitation. But within the vault's inventories, something far more disturbing emerged. Among blueprints for V2 derivatives, experimental jet designs, and interrogation transcripts of Nazi scientists were files marked Psychologische Opety, psychological experiments. Others bore the designation Projekt Morgenröte, Dawn Project, alongside handwritten notes in German and Russian that referred to behavioral control, long-distance transmission of human thought, and neurological interference fields. The first Western description of these materials appeared in a 1993 memorandum circulated within the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, based on interviews with defectors from the Russian military archives. The report described a Soviet cache of wartime German research pertaining to psychophysiological manipulation and advanced propulsion systems. The same report claimed the vault also contained records of pre-war joint experiments conducted between Soviet and Nazi scientists from 1939 to 1941 during the brief period of cooperation under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Such collaboration was officially denied by both nations after 1945. Yet among the vaults seized, documents were joint laboratory reports from Smolensk University and the Reich's Institute for Aviation Medicine, complete with signatures of both German and Soviet researchers. One of the most controversial items listed in the vault's inventory was a 228-page dossier labeled R7K Bio. It contained notes and diagrams for an experiment described as neural synchronization via electromagnetic resonance, allegedly conducted in 1940 in Königsberg. The document proposed using ultra-shortwave signals to induce emotional responses at distance. Soviet scientists who reviewed the material in 1946 deemed it scientifically unorthodox, but potentially exploitable. An NKVD progress report dated 1948 stated that preliminary replication attempts were made at a facility in Novosibirsk under the supervision of Colonel Sergei Myasnikov, later chief of the KGB's Technical Directorate. His notebooks, recovered decades later, reference captured German equipment of unknown manufacture and biological volunteers requisitioned from Gulag Camp 17. Western awareness of the Siberian vault remained limited until the mid-1990s, when a retired GRU officer named Major Viktor Trubetskoy defected to Finland. During debriefing, he described personally escorting several crates from Smolensk to Moscow in 1945, containing Reich intelligence files concerning English and American operations. Trubetskoy claimed that Stalin had ordered the material sealed indefinitely, fearing that public release would reveal the true scope of Soviet-German cooperation before 1941. Among those files, he alleged, were correspondences between the NKVD and the Gestapo on the exchange of captured Polish officers. A claim that, if verified, would have rewritten the history of the Katyn massacre. When journalists attempted to verify his story, they found that all related files had vanished from the archives. The Russian Ministry of Defense denied any record of Vault 731B's existence. In 1998, an investigative team from the Kommersant newspaper obtained leaked photographs of several recovered vault crates stored temporarily at the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, Samo, in Podolsk. The images showed bundles of aged paper tied with string, stamped Geheime Reichssache, secret Reich matter, and annotated with Cyrillic inventory numbers. One photograph depicted a cover sheet bearing both Stalin's and Lavrenti Beria's signatures, approving further scientific evaluation of German special research. Experts identified some documents as part of the missing Ahnenerbe archives, files from Himmler's SS Research Institute thought destroyed in 1945. The vault's connection to Siberia arose from Soviet relocation orders dated 1952. Fearing Western espionage, the NKVD reportedly transferred the most sensitive materials eastward to a classified facility outside Tomsk known as Object 128. There, German and Soviet engineers allegedly worked on propulsion research derived from Peenemunde's designs, combined with data from captured Japanese laboratories in Manchuria. The amalgamation of Axis science under Soviet supervision was a secret so immense it could not be publicly acknowledged without undermining the entire post-war narrative of ideological opposition. After Stalin's death in 1953, Beria assumed partial oversight of the vault's contents. A surviving memorandum in the Lubyanka archives, dated June 1953, just weeks before Beria's execution, reads, "Comrade Beria requests immediate consolidation of Reich technical archives under Directorate Vostok. Priority to files pertaining to energy weapons and biological influence projects." The next notation, written in a different hand, reads simply, "Action delayed, Director neutralized." When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the disarray of its bureaucracies created opportunities for plunder. Several vault crates disappeared during the chaotic reorganization of the archives. Black market collectors began circulating fragments of documents that appeared to originate from Vault 731B, German technical sketches, field interrogation transcripts, and coded reports stamped with both swastika and hammer and sickle insignia. The authenticity of these papers remains disputed, but one fragment, now held in private hands, bears the typed heading, Joint Conference on Propulsion Research, Smolensk, 1940. The Russian government maintains strict silence. Requests for access to Vault 731B by historians or journalists are routinely denied under the pretext of state security. Yet in 2010, a brief entry appeared in an internal Ministry of Defense bulletin noting the reorganization of Special Repository 731B and the digitization of captured foreign materials. The entry vanished from subsequent editions. A single witness account may shed light on what remains inside. In 2004, a former archivist named Elena Kovalchuk, who worked briefly at Znamenka before her retirement, claimed to have seen the vault herself. In an interview with Novaya Gazeta, she described a smell of oil and paper, strange black boxes with glass tubes, and a file cabinet labeled in both German and Russian with the word control. When asked why the materials were never made public, she replied, "Because the war never ended for them. It only changed its language. The fate of the Siberian vault is unknown. Some intelligence historians believe portions were moved again, perhaps to a new classified facility east of Krasnoyarsk. Others suspect the materials were quietly destroyed to prevent foreign scrutiny. Yet the existence of the vault has been indirectly confirmed through cross-referenced archival lists in both Russian and American holdings, which mention the same inventory numbers. In the dim corridors of the Ministry of Defense, the welded door on Znamenka Street remains sealed. The plaque beside it, added after the discovery in 1992, bears an inscription in both Russian and German. History is the final custodian. Beneath layers of bureaucracy and dust, the papers of two regimes, once enemies, briefly collaborators, wait in silence. Within their pages lie the true boundaries of the Second World War, drawn not in blood, but in secrecy. And somewhere in those yellowing files, perhaps, the proof that the war's end was only an illusion, a convenient line drawn across a map while, in the depths of Moscow, its secrets continued to breathe in the dark. The pages are brittle now, but they still breathe, ink bleeding through the years like veins of memory that refuse to die. Every sealed crate, every burned communique, every empty corridor is a testimony not to what was won, but to what was hidden. Truth in these shadows is not revelation, it's infection. It spreads quietly, contaminating certainty, unraveling the myths we built to sleep at night. Somewhere, in an unnamed archive or a forgotten vault, the last witness still waits, cold, patient, untouched by time. And when the locks fail, when the dust gives way to the sound of opening metal, the world may hear what was meant never to be spoken again. Not the end of a war, but the echo of its unburied heart beating faintly in the dark.